Is it on? Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're having an amazing time at the Aspen Ideas Festival. My name is Rhett Buttle. I have the extreme privilege of curating the economic content here at the Aspen Ideas Festival. And with that comes a lot of people grabbing you around campus, giving you lots of feedback. And so the last few days, I've been getting poked by people, and people are like, you're not doing enough on AI, or we haven't seen an AI session. And the reason for that is because, quite frankly, like, AI has been a force throughout all of our conversations, whether it's been on data or on labor or whatever it is. But now we are here, we are having a full AI session. And so really excited about this conversation. We have an amazing set of panelists. Before I turn it over to our moderator, I just wanted to recognize Aspen obviously has the Aspen Ideas Festival, but a huge pillar of our program is our amazing policy and leadership programs. And so I just wanted to take a moment to recognize Vivian, who's standing up to help one get in the row, who's one of our amazing policy program directors. She runs Aspen Digital and has been a real leader on AI and bringing people together. So please, if you want to learn more about the work that the Institute is doing on AI, please be in touch with Vivian. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn the conversation over to now a friend and colleague, Lauren Hirsch, who's the business reporter at the New York Times. So Lauren, over to you.
All right, thanks guys. And it is true that every conversation I have had AI has dominated. So I am so excited to spend the next 50 minutes with you guys. And let me introduce my esteemed panel. Todd McCracken, president of the National Small Business Association. He represents the NSBA in settings including the U.S. Congress, where he has testified numerous times on issues ranging, I got cut off, on many issues. Vilas Dar is president and a trustee of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, a global philanthropy advancing AI and data solutions to create a thriving, sustainable future. Alexandra Musavijadin, I'm sorry, I'm in the opposite order, is the co-founder and co-CEO of Evident, an AI benchmarking intelligence platform, and Teresa Carlson is the founding president of the General Catalyst Institute. She worked with governments to accelerate national resilience at a global scale in applied AI, defense, national security, energy, and a whole bunch of other sectors. Previously, she was vice president of worldwide public sector at Amazon Web Services. All right, I am starting with a question for all of you. Dario Amodei recently said that, the CEO of Anthropic, recently said that AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs within 5 years and spike unemployment 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years. Raise your hands if you believe that. Pretty, like, you don't really believe it. All right, panel, what do you guys think? Do you believe what he says? No. So why do you think he said that then?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I'll dig right into it. Why do tech billionaires say things that are so deeply like supportive of an agenda of a tech company?
Yes.
We could have that conversation. Maybe let's go a different direction. Look, I think Dario's great, and we should talk about what Dario has to say, but maybe we should start from the basics, right?
I don't know, but I'm curious why you think he said that.
I think if you are selling a product to the world whose primary job is to get adopted by companies to increase productivity and profitability, one of the best things you can say is, hey, look, we'll keep you from having to deal with the hard, messy human work of hiring and training workers. It's like catnip to CEOs.
Right, fair.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
No, Tracy, you go first.
Well, I have a different view, I think. I think he probably, obviously I can't speak for him,
Of course.
but one of the things is probably to get a rise, to get people thinking through this, because we are not having enough conversation on how we retrain and retool the workforce. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we do see people go a little extreme on what they just say to try to get us to wake up and realize this is an issue that we all have to be discussing and talking about and solving. And I think that's one of the things he realizes, we've got to rethink our workforce now.
I'm maybe a little less generous to Dario, but I think, so I think what he is also saying is, I'm going to scare everyone a little bit, and I'm going to make sure that all eyes are on our work, and that we're the only ones who can handle it. And so anyone else who's going to go out and develop large language models, it's not a good idea, leave it to us. So it supports his business model. I mean, maybe that's a bit cynical, but and I also think it is one should say that report saying that 50% of white-collar workers are going to disappear in 1 to 5 years it's a really, one should be really careful saying that, because that can lead to all kinds of hesitation where there shouldn't be, where it would lead to sort of, where it will get harder to adopt, where there is nothing to fear, but it's actually really good for productivity. And so I think those words should be said with care, and I'm not quite sure that he did sort of the global sort of AI adoption across businesses a service by issuing that statement and that report. So, and I also think it's wrong. I think the data is wrong. I think for a number of reasons we can get into later, but I think it is inaccurate.
Go please, Ted.
I don't know if he's right or wrong.
Yeah.
But I do think the statement is useful a little bit in the sense that I represent the small business community, and I think it has shocked a lot of them into taking AI much more seriously than they have.
Oh.
Am I not turned on?
Might have a little switch.
Can't see it.
I don't want to. Can someone maybe come help? I don't know how to work this. Could someone? Yeah, we got a mic. Even better. Pop star.
That's perfect. No, from the small business perspective, I think a lot of companies have been sort of deferring the day when they take AI seriously, right? They think it's something for tomorrow, something they'll worry about when it becomes a little bit more clear, and I think it really has, whether his statistic is right or wrong, whatever his motivation was, I think it has spurred action, attention, and focus in a way that I think is really useful.
And we're talking about it.
Yeah, there you go. Opened up the panel, and for both Teresa and you, I'll start with you. You mentioned reskilling. I was just on a panel where there was a whole conversation around that. Within small businesses, what is the efforts to ready either new workers or older workers who don't have the skill set?
You're asking me?
Yep.
In all candor, there's not a lot of efforts underway right now. In 75% of companies will tell you, in a survey we just helped conduct, that they are exploring AI, but only 25% of them are actually using it, right? Actively using AI. Mm-hmm. They haven't yet figured out which jobs might get replaced, exactly how it's going to enhance their workforce. They don't know who they need to retrain, who they want to keep. So it's all of this is very much an exploratory phase in the small business community right now.
And what would your wish be from a government support perspective, from a private sector support perspective?
There's a lot of need for training and help for the small business community. There's going to be a huge shift, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later, I think, in the makeup of the small business community, I think, because of this. Because small business owners, the most successful startups tend to be middle-aged and older, contrary to what you see in the popular culture. The most successful new startups are run by people who are in an older demographic. I think AI might really shift that. Mm-hmm. And it's going to change the nature of who small business is.
Teresa, what do you think the private sector's responsibility is?
I think it's big. I think it's very big. When I was at AWS, one of my mandates is part of one of my business units. I ran training and education, so it's part of my business. And the last year I was there, we made a commitment that we would train 27 million people by 2027 globally in all levels of cloud. Well, now look at where we are in AI. So we need all of these companies like Anthropic that are developing these tools. They have a very deep responsibility to take on the curriculum, make sure that because nobody knows it better. And one of the things I'll just share that we struggled with back when it was cloud, now you've got cloud plus AI, is that you had to get the universities, which is it's an issue because universities innately want to charge. Mm-hmm. They have a charge structure. And what we wanted to say is we don't want to charge, we just want people to be trained. So we started creating a lot of vocational programs, community college programs. But look, we have a long way to go. And I'll say, I'm seeing a lot of individuals begin to use AI to teach their children at home. So it's not just understanding AI, but it's also how we're going to use AI to teach and train in the right. It's coming. We have to, it's coming. It's here already. So we just have to make sure that everybody has a responsibility. But to your point, the large corporates absolutely have a very large responsibility with this.
And I know you have thoughts on the cost of all of this.
Sure, two things. I mean, one is, I shared with you, Lauren, I spent the last 12 months going around America to small towns and villages and rural communities and talking to them about AI. And I just want to name two things that force us into some intellectual rigor on this topic. The first is you might say entry-level jobs will be displaced because of AI, but it's not necessarily the case that because of that, the benefit of that accrues to the employer. Instead, what we're going to see is a lot of companies that are going to come forward and say, I'm building a little product, and it can displace somebody that you use to do a job by selling you a product, and for that, you can pay me a premium. We saw what happened when Amazon went out and disrupted commerce. We thought that it would lead to more increased productivity and lots more manufacturing, and instead you had a platform that actually took the economic benefits and accrued it to the company. So in AI, the first thing we should think about is not necessarily that having a more productive AI ecosystem is actually good for small businesses. It's going to be good for someone. And that someone, we don't quite know who it is yet. It might be the large AI tech players. It might be a new set of AI-based companies that emerge. But no matter what, I don't think we can make the argument that that's good for American productivity. We should start with that as one piece. And the second frame to this is, look, I think you're absolutely right. We are in such an exploratory phase here that it's easy to make a proclamation about how our short-term economic model is going to shift. And it might be that half of our entry wage jobs go away. The question we should be asking is not, hey, is that a valid assumption or not because a tech person said it? But what are the credible intellectual models we have coming out of the academy, coming out of data-backed observation that let us make policy decisions about what that means for America and how we actually ensure that that actually leads to a good outcome?
So what the small companies that Todd works with, what should they be doing right now?
I mean, I think there's easy answers and there's hard answers. The easy answers are, I think, one we probably all agree on, increasing AI fluency broadly across the American population, right? From educational curriculum to skilling and training on AI, I think all of that is great. Because when these changes come, people need to have a base of knowledge with which they make a decision about whether they want to adopt a new tool or not, about whether they want to fire a worker they have or not. But the second part is there's something unique about the domain knowledge of small business owners that we continue to ignore. I'll give you an example. I was at a shipyard recently, and one of the decisions the owner of that shipyard is facing is to make one of three decisions. Continue with the 40 people who are currently in a welding job, to engage with a vendor who's coming in and saying, over the next 5 years, I'll be able to sell you a robot that will displace those workers one-to-one. Or potentially a third option, which is a speculative option, which is buy a piece of equipment that does the work of 120 welders, but requires 40 people to make it function in the industry. Each of those comes with a different choice, a choice around capital expenditure, around what kind of business sustainability you want to run, about how much you want to invest in technology. But that decision is never going to be made for them by somebody at an AI company. It's going to be made by somebody who deeply understands the practice of shipbuilding. What we need to do is make sure that we're empowering small business owners, medium-sized business owners, large business owners to be able to make an AI decision that's not foisted on them by a tech company who's selling them a product, but is driven by their unique knowledge of their competitive advantage and their ability to make a decision about that complexity that every business owner feels every time they have to make a choice like this.
I think you're exactly right, and that is the real danger for small businesses, is they're going to be confronted with the potential purchase of essentially a variety of off-the-shelf AI products, much like in a lot of software today. Whereas larger companies are going to be able to design their own AI models, their own, and that matches their own needs much more specifically. And that's the challenge for the small business community. It's not unique to AI. It cuts across fields. But AI, I think, is going to have such a transformative effect on the economy that it's much more important now in this particular occasion.
All right, Alexandra, I'm going to read you some numbers that I'm sure this whole panel is very familiar with. Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, Google have collectively told investors they expect to spend $320 billion on infrastructure costs this year, much of which will go towards building AI centers. We've all been reading about the race to poach AI talent, $100 million contracts. You're working with companies investing in AI all the time. Do you feel confident that they have a plan for all that money they're deploying?
No. No, but I think there's two sides to the investment discussion, right? There's all of the investment that's going into the development of AI, so the ones that we know, and Meta has just bought out quite expensively Scale AI's capabilities. We can get into that in a minute. So there's all of this money barreling at, getting to AGI or getting to higher and higher performance, building better and better tools, and that's the $300 billion. And so that race is going on. Who can get to the outer edge of this technology and build the best agentic AI tools and solutions and so on. And then you've got the other race, which is big businesses are also spending $200 billion, if not $300 billion, annually on AI deployment, right? So there's development side, and then there's the deployment, to your point. The decisions that the businesses, the shipyards, or the JP Morgans, or the banks across America, insurance companies, manufacturers that are making the choices or not to invest into AI capabilities for a number of reasons. Some are to stay competitive. You know, in the financial services sector, there's literally is an existential race going on. Everyone is trying to outspend, outpace, out-implement on AI, Gen AI use cases going into production, agentic AI use cases going into production. Jamie Dimon says we've got 600 use cases and we've got $2 billion on our return on investment, and the other banks are following suit. And so that's also going on. So that deployment part, that race is, to your point, this is where, you know, big business and small business, this is sort of where the fault lines are being drawn up. And this is where those that, and I would say that I spend my time, you know, we run a benchmarking company that benchmarks exactly where the businesses are in their deployment. So where their use cases and where's the impact of that, what's the ROI. And you can see it's sort of the race of staying ahead, growing the market share. But I would say one thing on the employment, and I think it is really important that we obviously think about how this is going to impact. If you look at where we were just before the advent of the internet, right? We couldn't see what's on the other side, but it led to a lot of growth increases and a lot of disruption too. And we're exactly at that point now, in that point in time where we're at that explosion. But one thing I think is from observing from our data, right? And sort of we look at what are businesses spending on AI, what are their use cases, what is the impact, and what are they hiring? So we track every AI hire and every other hire. So you can see that the organizations that are leading, they're spending, that are implementing it well, that are getting to that sort of growing market share and so on, they're hiring way more across the board. And so we've got these stories about, and obviously there are cases where you're going to have to, you know, trim because you're shifting and processes are changing. But as a big organization, the ones that are leading on AI adoption are the companies that are hiring the most, and the ones that haven't started are the ones that are falling behind. And so we see this bifurcation, and that gap between the leading organizations and the lagging is only growing, and it's growing at such a pace that I'd be really worried about not getting on top of that AI, you know, focus and AI investment.
So I totally understand this sense of there's this coming wave, we have to get on it or be swallowed by the wave. But I was also fascinated to see, I think it was your 2024 report, that only 2 banks reported ROI on their AI investments. It just seems kind of antithetical to the idea of how a financial firm thinks about operating. Like how can they justify that, spending that much money and make, well, we'll get back to you?
Because, okay, so if you're a bank and you're reporting, you know, the minute you go out and say this is our return on our investment, you know, the big banks are spending somewhere between 10 and 17 billion on technology, and about a third of that is on emerging technology, and that's sort of AI. And it's all of the shareholders and any earnings calls are waiting for that. Like, what's the return on investment? So it's not. You can only really go out and talk about your return on investment once you're really, really sure that you can keep growing that number, and that actually you're orchestrated enough internally that you've figured out, like, of all of the hundreds of use cases or thousands of use cases you got in testing and moved into production, that actually the real, you know, and the return is a real return, not just an expected return. And I would just say, maybe just a last point on that, is that we're really early days.
Yeah.
I mean, the 25%, I'm not surprised at all. We're just in the foothills of adoption. And when we're looking at why big organizations are hesitant in talking about the ROI, is because it was only really put, I mean, the banks have been, you know, dealing with AI for decades. But when we had ChatGPT released, was just sort of how do we get our head around what the use cases are, testing, and we're only in this phase where we're slowly getting these use cases put into production. And it's going to take a long time. Even things that seem table stakes are going to take 3, 5, 7 years before we see them come through.
Teresa, I'd love your view on this. You've been on tech forever. I mean, is there any concern there's a little bit of FOMO driving this investment as well? And maybe JP Morgan might know what they're doing, but no offense, that, you know, Pepsi they may have a little bit less expertise as they're throwing money at this.
Well, there is always going to be some they're marketing themselves out there because they have to stay competitive. And I think about, when we're talking about the banks, when I had financial services under me, so I know a little bit about how they adopt. And you have some that are early adopters and some that kind of wait. But the one thing that they all freak out about is if they believe one is getting a big competitive advantage. So they do have to, I agree completely, this is very early days, it's moving very slowly. But what I think we'll see is we're going to see it move slowly and then really fast. Yeah. And we call it applied AI, because what is missing is these large enterprises are struggling on how they actually get it, I call it, in the belly of their business, because they're getting these kind of periphery applications that are easier, like the analytics side, or how they review or write reports now, research. I mean, those are kind of easy ways, but how do you get it into the real belly of the business to see that big return on investment? And so I think part of it is FOMO, part of it is they've got to market themselves and showcase these work. I love what you talked about on use cases, because in my world, I always think about use cases and workloads. And I always wanted to see an increase in workloads. And I wanted every enterprise I worked with, I wanted to have an ownership of at least 50% of their workloads. That was kind of my bar for all this. And I think you'll see the same thing. They'll start to say, what are the workloads and how mission critical are these workloads? But the only other point I was going to make on the large tech companies, I can't speak for all, but I've worked for Microsoft and Amazon, and we were very methodical about the way you can't just throw a bunch of numbers out there if you're a public company and not have a plan, like your shareholders. So you have to have some level of trust, right, that they know what they're doing. And they are not looking for a 2-year return on investment. They probably got a 15 to 20-year return, because they don't want to be behind. But I will say we should all be aware that when they talk about these numbers and what they're doing, the only way that they can accomplish this is if all the other parts and pieces come together. And what I mean by that is energy. If they have enough energy sources. We know they don't have that today. And with the new budget that we're looking at, there's a potential cut in wind and solar and nuclear on tax incentives, which could be a huge problem. I mean, all these things have to come together. So they need the energy to run it. They need the hardware and chips to make it go on the GPU side. And they have to always be keeping up with the most efficient. And then we are talking about AI doing more. They're coding, and both Satya and Andy, and I think have said 30% of their coding is now being done by artificial intelligence. And you should expect to see that continue. But that doesn't mean they don't need the brightest and best coders and developers in their thinking and thought leadership around this. So I would just keep in mind, when they put those numbers out there, we could be looking at maybe a longer return, because all of these other, I call it whack-a-mole, all these other pieces have to come together for AI to work. And by the way, in America, we want that to happen because we desperately have to stay ahead of China.
When you are talking to the CEOs behind the scenes, not on stage, are they saying, I am so excited this is going to transform our company, the country? Or are they saying, really hope this works out?
I mean, it's a combination.
Yeah.
They are excited because they see, like, companies like Crescendo is one we invested in that does call centers. And I remember when I was selling stuff to call centers, and now call centers are all AI driven. And, you know, good or bad, we're seeing health applications. And when they see what in these critical areas where there's not enough staffing, it's a really fantastic model, and the CEOs love that. But I think what they're very worried about is how they, again, implement it through governance processes across their enterprise. And you have AI issues, you have privacy issues. They worry about all these things, and we're still so early. Back to your point, we don't have all these models created yet.
Speaking of both governance and the bill currently being worked on in D.C., there's, as I'm sure you all know, a proposal of a 10-minute moratorium on state-level regulation on AI. Is that a good idea?
A 10-year moratorium, federal preemption, the idea that we want to stop states from independently regulating AI and say that the federal government has the ability to do that over the next 10 years. I think it is one of the most misunderstood pieces of kind of legislative priorities that have been set forth. And I think it's actually perfect to bring into this room, although I tend not to comment on public legislation. But let's talk about the whys behind it. On one side, what you hear is the federal government is telling states not to do anything on this. And it's happening in an environment where states have actually made some pretty incredible progress. California, Colorado, Utah recently passed legislation that has actually been detrimental to tech companies. The Utah bill in particular mandates individual data portability, which means that if you are a person that uses a social network, you should be able to take your data and go to a different social network and be able to use it there, including your graph. So we can think about all the different bundle of motivations around something like this. On one side, you might say, well, we want to keep states from doing this because it might hurt tech companies. On the other, you might say, actually having state-level regulation of AI is a bad idea because it means that a company who usually operates across the entire United States now has to pay attention to every state's rules and regulations before deploying a product. I'm not going to take a position on it, although I will happily do so afterwards if anybody wants to have a chat. But what I will say is this. Inside of this debate is a more fundamental play on questions of equity and justice and participation, about who gets to make decisions about how our data is used, about how these AI tools will be deployed. And one of the big things that's missing consistently here is any kind of participatory process. I don't know how many small business owners have been consulted in your network on whether they think this should be regulated at a state or a national level. I certainly know that as a citizen, nobody's asked me. So instead, what you have is a very small set of interests that are lobbying a particular set of legislation that's going to affect every American in really meaningful ways. And it's happening in the construct of narratives that never feel particularly like they're aligned to our agency.
Todd, I'd love your view. Some of the concerns I've heard about the moratorium are, I understand the concern about a patchwork, but is federal legislation ever coming? In 10 years is a very long time.
That's the conundrum, right? Is we on this sort of thing, we always favor a federal framework in general, within reason. Federal privacy legislation is, it's the other side of this. We have been for a federal framework instead of a patchwork of state frameworks. This is similar to that, but a very different scenario, and I think it's appropriate to be skeptical whether we will see federal regulation anytime soon.
Can I just say something on this? We are pro. I've been spending 24/7 on this the last 2 weeks. So I would say we are, to put this in framework, we have about 1,000 companies around the world we invest in. We're the second largest venture capital firm in the world. And it's the number one issue our companies are concerned about. And it's because, I'll give you just one good example. In Europe, when we meet with our companies there, believe it or not, 90% of them are doing most of their work, guess where? US. And the reason is because they have no level of confidence in the EU regulatory environment right now. And they can't even get good answers. And if they build a business there right now, they want to build a business in Europe. We want them to build a business in Europe. We want Europe to thrive. But they have no level of confidence. And if we create an environment in the US where our most innovative companies doing the best work around AI have no level of confidence that they can create their product and survive, we are going to fall way behind. So I think just as of, 5 or 6 hours ago, that 10-year has been negotiated down to a 5-year, by the way. Okay. So it's in the Senate being voted on right now. But we think it is because of just exactly what you were saying. The states don't yet know how, and they're even asking, some of the states are asking the federal government, give us a set of mechanisms, a framework. And this won't be a forever thing, but it's because AI is so new, we need the federal government at this point in time to kind of be the overseer to get this going and then let the states come in. And there's lots of details. It's not that the states can't do anything, by the way. They do have some control. But I would just say we are very much for it because we need our companies to thrive, and they won't be able to if you have 1,000 different bills out there.
Alexandra, so, while we're waiting for more regulation, we're effectively relying on companies. As you're working with companies, how advanced are the companies on a governance, risk management perspective as compared to a pure investment perspective?
No, I mean, they're really struggling, right? Because they're knitting the parachute as they're jumping out the plane. And that is, they're putting use cases into production, Gen AI use that have, take banks, for example, really regulated, obviously regulated sector. They have had governance, they've got a first and second and third line of defense when they put models through that touches the client in any way, which has been totally fine with traditional AI because it's linear and it's understandable and you can replicate the same, model and it gives the same result. That's basically what the governance does and says, well, that's the second line of defense, that's your model validation without getting too technical. But then you've got Gen AI or agentic AI use cases that are sort of, that throw up all kinds of results every time. So how do you regulate that? And how do you come up with governance structures that are following the technology when you actually can't use your current governance structures for the same? So again, that knitting the parachute is happening right now. So right now, what we're seeing from a governance, like a really practical governance perspective from a regulated sector, which will be the same for pharma and other highly regulated sectors, is they're working hand in hand with the regulators because they've got to, they're like, and you've got to create thresholds. You're like, is this threshold okay? Like it's 98%. Yeah. It's like, it seems fine. The regulator says, okay, let it go. So that's sort of how it's happening right now. But there's a backlog. So to this point where it's going to take some time, you've got this, loads of Gen AI use cases that are coming through and getting pushed through to production. And the ones that are customer facing have the governance issue. Then you've got agentic AI use cases that are barreling behind. And there's a sort of, there's a pipeline question here too. And governance is the bottleneck. So, and then just to your point, because I could not agree more, I mean, the mess in Europe, and I'm Danish, by the way, so I'm very self-critical here on that, but it is, EU AI Act is neither here nor there, and they're probably going to stop it anyway because it's so impossible to implement, and it doesn't, the way that this, regulating, and I might get into trouble saying this, but, regulating the tools is like trying to, and at the tool level, which is a lot of where the state, SB 1047, which came out of California, was doing that. And there's a lot of tension of, do you regulate and stop open source so the commercial large language models can continue? Because that's also why I don't think it's good to happen at a state level. Something comes up from a state level, it filters up to the federal level, and if you're suddenly closing off the ability of open source models to be out there in the market, that then completely crushes the US strength in terms of research and so on, is my view. But when you have something that's too, federal, lots of different rules coming out from different states, it's going to be really hard for big US and global organizations to operate here. So there's a real chance and opportunity for the US to set a really good governance structure for companies to thrive, because that's not happening in Europe.
Yeah, I will say, one of my fears, well, I agree that I think a federal framework is far preferable to multitude state frameworks for AI for sure. I do worry that the moratorium will sort of release the pressure on Congress to develop those regulations in the first place, because businesses create a lot of pressure on Congress to act on some of these things when they see the states doing a whole bunch of different things. That's what creates the sort of drive to get Congress to act. So it can cut both ways.
And I do worry, the idea that corporate governance is a bottleneck makes complete sense, but of course, we do have a problem where we tend to socialize risk. So as companies are investing and moving forward, whose fault? Alexander, I'm curious, like if AI at a big bank causes some sort of financial shock, like is there a policy within the banks right now as to whose responsibility, who does that fall on?
The banks.
No, but is it like the guy who runs AI? Is it Jamie Dimon? Like, is there a reporting structure?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. I mean, there are two kinds of risks when it comes to finance, and you have been in this for a long time too. But so Gary Gensler was like, hang on a second. If everyone's using the same models, your Goldmans and your big asset managers and all the traders are using the same types of models, at some point they're going to go into. It's what happened. I don't know if you remember long-term capital in 1998, right? That was not quite the analogy that works, but it sort of works, right? Because if everything's based on the same large language models and they're completely identical, then you can have a situation where that is, you can create some real bad shocks in the world because they are, they're not diverse enough. But the fact is that every large language model or small language model is pulled into your trading system or your banking system, and then it is adapted to your own data, right, in-house. So that type of risk I'm not so worried about. The risks that you create in the financial services, the ones that are, well worried about, are the ones that are, faulty trade decisions or faulty loan decisions. And I would say that the banks are more paranoid about it than anyone else, because if they make a wrong decision two people apply for the same loan, they've got the same data points, and one is denied and the other one isn't, you kind of go out of business. Because no one, Goldman Sachs did have a real issue with that. I can't remember when it was Apple, it was 7 years ago, and they had to, a lot of that had to be stopped, right? Because if you lose your trust with your clients, because you're not managing your AI, and you're taking the human out of the loop, your AI has to be really good. So you're holding the bar, just like driverless cars, and that sort of in the financial services world, that bar is just as high. You can't make a wrong decision. But again, obviously, the question of risk is ever there for financial services. I just don't think that AI is going to contribute to it.
And one of the things that's interesting hearing that takes me back to the early days of cloud, which people aren't talking about, is we don't talk a lot about legal frameworks for this. And I can tell you behind the scenes, in the early days of trying to get customers to adopt cloud, there was no attorney that knew how to do a cloud computing contract. They knew how to do a licensing contract. We'd trained them really well on licensing. But now, fast forward, you can bet behind the scenes between the tech companies and the large enterprises, there's a lot of legalese language going on that is not evolved completely yet. So that is also just legally, to your point, who's responsible, who has risk, who's going to. So there's a lot that really we still don't talk about much. We talk about the adoption, but we also don't talk about the frameworks that lead up to that adoption and getting it deployed.
And do you think, go ahead, I see you excited to talk.
No, let me say two things. One, positionality. I recognize that I sit here as the head of a multi-billion-dollar public foundation. I don't have stockholders, I'm not selling anything to anyone, which means that I'm willing to engage in a pragmatic and practical conversation about how companies get easier on-ramps to be able to sell their goods, and I think that's great. I'm a committed capitalist, I think that's wonderful. What we have missed in this entire conversation is that whole set of what does this mean for everyday people? What does it mean for our capacity to represent our interests in this AI-developed world that's coming? You mentioned the privacy bill. I really appreciated that. A fundamental set of what are human interests in an AI-enabled world around access to jobs, around access to training, around access to skilling. And we cannot have a regulatory environment where we assume that corporate interests are going to advise the government on how we should regulate AI and assume that somehow that's going to be different than what happened with the internet, what happened with social media, or what happened with any number of other industries.
I could not agree more, and I think that is such an important, and we forget it sometimes because we're sitting in the engine room of how is this being adopted in the sort of technical aspects. But there are very few nations that have I think asked themselves that question in a profound way. But sorry again for the Nordic flex here, but the Finnish government 5 or 6 years ago did something really amazing. They said everyone needs to be proficient in this. Everyone needs to know, what's going on in the tech development, AI. And then when Gen AI came on, everyone was given, I can't remember the amount, but training and understanding and education, sort of slightly technical, but sort of just as a user. So you were proficient, and it was kids, and it was it was elderly, it was all the way through, and that has actually it has done a couple of things. It has meant that adoption in Finland has been much higher, and it has meant that everyone feels that they know what they're dealing with, and so they sort of remove that fear factor. But it's also just meant that they've taken it in the good way into their everyday lives. And I think that is something that is hard to do in a big country like the US. Of course it is. But if we could have that mindset here, that would be great.
So absolutely agree. If I can finish the thought, and I agree with you entirely. I think that here's the proposition I would put forward. If we want to do what our president and vice president call be the dominant global force on AI, there is a way to do that, to expand our thinking, to actually follow some of the Nordic example, to think about how we make public investment in AI infrastructure, how we tie AI capacity to bridging the digital divide. These all sound like cliches, and yet they are really clear policy frameworks we could apply. How do we invest in making sure that we're actually building broad-based AI literacy at scale? And how does that work its way into regulation, just next to the fact that we'll limit liability for companies for the AI products they deploy? We have to have the holistic conversation.
Can I make one comment on that? I wanted to share, I agree so much with this, and this is why we actually started the General Catalyst Institute, is to collaborate and work with policymakers around the world. Because these words are easy to say, but policymakers don't understand this. So unless I see a lot of people going in to kind of beat them up, but we have to go in and say, look, We're here to support. We're here to give you these ideas and help you put the words and the frameworks together. Because they, and I mean this with all due respect, if you go look at their staff, they don't have a group of staffers that technically are competent in doing this. And drones is a great example. I remember when Jeff Bezos said we're gonna, take drones and deliver it to everybody. Well, that was a good idea, but there was no policy or framework in the U.S., and there's still not one. And now we're going to fight wars. So I would say the onus also is on folks like us to really work with our lawmakers, and that is why we set up the Institute at GC for that sole purpose, to do that.
And do you find that true even in this administration? They've obviously made a big push to hire from the tech and AI community.
And again, I mean, I've been doing this for 28 years with governments, and they are trying. I will have to say this administration, I would say the Obama administration was one of the best. Bush had some really good people. The Obama administration, for you all who may not remember this, that administration actually is the one that got laptops and cell phone usage. They couldn't even get laptops in the White House. So you have these iterations, but I would say this administration is trying. But we got to remember there's two parts. We got to talk to the White House, the executive branch, and we've got to talk to the legislative branch. And you've got to treat them equal in doing this education and make sure that we're at the table. And I see a lot of people give up, and this is where you don't give up. If you really are committed to this, you have to be in there bipartisanly every day working with these lawmakers and the White House. And even though you get frustrated, it's not for the faint of heart. If we really believe in this mission, we just really have to keep at it.
Todd has.
I was just going to say that's exactly right. I mean if something's going to pass, it's got to go through Congress, and they have to feel comfortable they are regulating a world that they can envision, that they understand how this is going to work and what it all means. They don't want to regulate something that is the wrong thing, or that sends things in a completely opposite direction. They feel like they've done that in the past. Maybe they did that at some point with the internet 30 years ago, and they don't want to do it again. So that means it might take a little bit more time. But I actually think Congress is doing a reasonably good job putting together some task forces, some working groups that have really worked through these issues, put together some pretty good reports, and they really are educating themselves better than you might guess. But they're not all the way there yet.
Well, I have more questions I want to ask, but I don't want to be selfish. So I'm going to open up the room. We have a microphone. Oh. And we have a question right up here.
You guys have been talking a lot about future legislation. How about what actually happened to the internet? Is that regulatory environment well developed, or is it still in the process of being developed? Because that could be a guide for what is likely to happen with this development.
There's a famous, if acerbic, tech columnist that we all know by name who loves to point out that we haven't passed a meaningful piece of federal tech legislation since 1996 in America. That should be the answer to your question, right? And in many ways, the echoes of that conversation into the AI space should actually really inform how we end up thinking about this. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything.
I would say, to your point, no, we're not done with that even. The internet, we're still debating that, quite frankly. So, yeah, we're pretty far behind.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rachel Korberg. I run the Families and Workers Fund. We're a philanthropy working to help low-income Americans thrive in good jobs. And I wanted to go back to the point by you, Vilas, around everyday Americans here. In an ideal world, what would you all put forward as sort of the minimum standard and the high road practice for companies when they're doing AI adoption, including where it leads to job change and also job loss? I think about this in other issue areas with compensation. We have a minimum wage, but we also have living wage and more competitive wages. In health, we have some minimum standards, like if you're a construction worker and you're working with a lot of debris, you're going to wear masks and protective equipment that your company provides. But if you're a company that's really trying to take the high road, you might be doing mental health and wellness offerings. So what's the equivalent of sort of the minimum and the high road for AI adoption right now?
I have a somewhat please.
No, you started.
I have a somewhat radical policy proposition, actually, that I've never really talked about publicly, but it's a great question. One of these is, I think, a really fundamental shift in how we encourage our small business owners to make a decision. The easy way is cost reduction. How do I deploy an AI system in a way that lets me reduce my costs of people, personnel, et cetera? There's a different way that we could think about it, which is how do we incentivize leaders to focus on productivity per worker. To say keep the same worker base, but use these tools in ways that improve their ability to drive outcomes. In so doing, drive revenue. But we all know that market forces won't let that happen by itself, which means you have to have a policy framework where there's support, financial, government support, that says as you're going through that transition phase, we will incentivize decisions that let you increase the productivity of your workforce. It's a bit of a tangential piece to what you said, but that gives you a frame for how we might think about a lot of questions in this space. Is if we said instead of driving for short-term efficiency, we drive for a social plus economic outcome that actually puts the worker first.
And I'll just say, I really agree with that. And the one thing I haven't seen our government do, which is a little bit worrisome, if you look at the UAE, who's been really ahead on their thinking with artificial intelligence, they went out very early and said, we're going to start curriculum in the very beginning, and we're going to have iterations of curriculum, and it's going to go all the way through our workforce. And anytime you see them, they're talking about it, and they're actually putting funding, and they're asking for help on the right policies. And I haven't seen us yet, it feels like in our education world, we're not, our government leaders are not talking enough about this. They talk about us being ahead, but they're not saying, we need to put curriculum in place right now and put a line in the sand on it. I'm from a teeny town in Kentucky, very rural. My boys laugh at me. They don't like me telling this story, but I had pot-bellied stoves in my junior high classroom. Both my parents were teachers. I'm from the rural of rural areas. And so I understand, and my parents both dedicated their life to education in those areas. And I just don't think we're getting out and having the conversations. And you've got to start that at the federal, state, and local levels. And like I said, I believe that companies, commercial entities do have a responsibility. And I would even think we should think about, is there for employment something that the commercial entities should actually be paying even in the rural areas? And anytime I hear the word rural, I'm all about it, because we are forgetting about those individuals that need to be trained and educated. So we're not doing enough, but I would say starting with just the conversation that it has to happen in AI and saying, because if the president says that and we're going to do it, think about those words. There's action that begins to happen around those words. And if that legislation happens, there's action around that.
Oh no. Shout.
I'll just shout. I actually agree with all of that, but I had one more thing that's sort of not exactly your question, but related. That is, I don't think in the small business community we're going to see significant layoffs of people because of AI.
It's not working. Oh, here we go. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see mass layoffs in the small business community. As for those of you who work in small business, you know that right now the chief problem small businesses have are not enough resources. That, in fact, they're going to use AI primarily to expand their abilities and to become more aggressive in pursuing more opportunities and growing their businesses. So there's a huge productivity gap, efficiency gap between larger companies and small companies right now. Economy of scale is a real thing. And AI, I think, is going to help with that a great deal. And that's not to say that jobs aren't going to change. I think that they're going to find ways to enable people to do different things in jobs. And maybe if someone leaves the small company, they might think about filling that position in a different kind of way that may adopt AI. But I genuinely don't think we're going to see small companies in any large numbers laying off masses of people and replacing them with AI. Not in the near term, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Here.
Well, let me take the mic back. Sorry.
Thank you so much for that question. I want to build off I'm Beth Goldberg. I work at Jigsaw, Google Incubator. Hey. I want to build off that last question and the title of this talk about the future of the economy. What are the future jobs that AI is going to create, and how are we going to get there? And we can take the sort of the high road and the low road again. Like, what are sort of the low income, like necessary but kind of grunt work jobs that we're going to be creating and needing here? And then where could we really be creating new higher income, higher opportunity roles? And where are those going to come from?
Thank you. I don't know who wants to kick that off.
Who wants to take that? Do you want to take that first?
I'm happy to keep going.
Now
I
you
feel like
have
I've
the
talked a
mic.
lot. Please, after you.
I genuinely don't know.
Just
That's the honest answer.
Agree.
I think we are in such an evolutionary early stage of this. I'm pretty confident that we're going to see a lot more efficiencies. I mean, we're seeing them right now, but just like we did a report in the 90s. I've been doing the small business thing long enough to know that we were looking at the future of jobs in the 90s. We tried to predict what the internet would mean for jobs, what they're going to create. And I got to say, we didn't know anything in the 90s about what ultimately happened. We made a lot of predictions. Half of them were right, half of them were wrong. And I think we got to be a little bit more humble in our pronouncements about what's going to happen.
Probably have time for one more question. You're raising your hand very enthusiastically, so.
Yeah, here.
My name is Michael Umansky. I run an open source agentic platform called SmithOS. So I've been doing this for a while. And the secret that's happening is in AI is this dichotomy between like autonomy and control. And so when I think about regulation in the future, the challenge I have is, and like the scariest thing I saw was DeepSeek this year coming out. Like, what's the point of regulating when some kid in China can open source a model like that, that's a reasoner model, and just put it out into the world?
Yeah, can I jump in on that
Please.
one? Completely agree. I mean, it's like you got open source. It's out there. Everyone can copy it. Everyone can take it on. Fit it to your own systems. Build it into your data. And an open source, the cat's out of the bag. I can't imagine that. So some of the regulation was to stop open source, which is nonsensical, right? You can't stop. What's that? Yeah, exactly. So my view on this is that the way to regulate, and I had by no means have the answer to what that should look like, because it is really difficult to do, because it's moving faster than anyone can actually sort of, you have one idea today, and in 6 months' time it's going to be, the technology is going to be doing things that are sort of outside of the scope of how you're thinking about regulation. My view is that the only way to do this is by sector, because you cannot do it by the tools, right? You cannot say all language model producers, open source or not, should be regulated. It's like regulating a spreadsheet and say, if you don't regulate the spreadsheet, I mean, that's how you stop fraud, because it's just not how you can do it. It's too proliferated, it's everywhere. Large language model providers are springing up everywhere. It's becoming cheaper to do. It's not easy to do, but it is. So you've got to regulate the use. You've got to be like, what is it that in the financial services or in pharma or in any other sectors that will create harm? And let's think about that, and let's really be careful in a sector-specific context what this tool can do. Because what it can do in banking, a specific tool will be, the same tool can do something that's really harmful in pharma. So it doesn't help, because if you then regulate the tool here, you will stop the development. So my view is that you've got to do it by sector. That's the only way.
I'll build on this with a very short answer, which is I think you regulate open source the same way you regulate bad drivers. First, you need rules of the road. You need to have a framework that says this is okay and this isn't. I think some of that comes from use cases and risks. I think some of it comes from norms and values. And then you need an enforcement function that says if you go beyond this, there is somebody who's going to come in and make sure you don't do it again. And we spend so much time on the first that we never talk about the second. I think to bring it back around to where we started our conversation, we started talking about the economy and jobs. We started talking about regulation. I think through all of it, there's just one through line, which is it is so easy to think about it as if predictions and speculation are a good substitute for data-driven, thoughtful, intellectual frameworks. So let's stop thinking about what a few people say that get covered in all the headlines and go back to the basics of what do we observe, what do we expect, what do we test, and how do we build policy that's based on that?
Well, thank you for the perfect closing note. Thank you all for coming.